If a photograph taken in the darkness of a Georgia plantation more than a century ago can speak 1,000 pages of history, would you dare to look closely? Tonight, we will follow the trail of that photograph, a boy with a determined gaze, standing barefoot on the ground beside a whip and iron chains. No one knows who he is or what happened after the camera closed. But in old diaries, forgotten letters, and a few smudged lines, a story emerges of a child who escaped slavery and used the very camera that once imprisoned him to record the truth for the world to see. This is not just a story of freedom, but also a journey of light through darkness of a small soul who dared to turn pain into legacy. So, before the story begins, if you love historical mysteries told in the whispers of time, subscribe to the Sleepy History Tales channel so you don't miss the stories waiting to be awakened in the darkness. It looked at first like a photograph of children at play. 5 of them, small figures in sepia tones, gathered in a loose circle under the faint light of a southern sky. Their poses suggested laughter, innocence, the kind of fleeting joy one might expect from childhood, long before the storm of history. Dr. James Carter almost passed it over that morning as he catalogued new acquisitions at the National Museum of African American History in Washington, D.C. The year on the back read 1858. The location Fairview Plantation, Georgia. He'd seen many such images before. Soft-edged photographs carefully composed to tell a lie, a comforting illusion, commissioned by those who wished to paint slavery as something gentle, even noble. Another piece of plantation propaganda, James murmured, but then something in the image made him pause. "Could you bring me the magnifier?" he asked quietly. Beneath the children's bare feet, the earth told a very different story. What had seemed like scattered toys were not toys at all, but small iron shackles half buried in the dirt. A slender whip, disguised as a branch, and near the edge of the frame, a metal collar lying in the grass behind the smallest child, a boy no older than 7. James felt the awe leave his chest. His assistant Helen leaned in beside him, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. They were forced to pose. James finally whispered, "Look at their eyes, because once you noticed, you couldn't unsee it." The smiles weren't smiles. They were masks. And the smallest boy, Thomas, as the faded handwriting on the back later revealed, wasn't simply afraid. His gaze held something rarer, a quiet defiance. Fairview Plantation, Georgia, 1858, the note read. Master Williams's Amusements, and beneath it, written in a shaking different hand, Thomas, age 7. Sold 3 days after. James sat in silence, the room suddenly too still. "This isn't just another plantation photo," he said softly. Someone wanted the truth recorded hidden, but there. The following morning, sunlight cut through the tall windows of the research room as James spread the photograph out beside plantation ledgers and slave sale records. Fairview. Plantation Helen found belonged to the Henderson family. William Henderson Jr., 19 years old in 1858, almost certainly the Master William mentioned in the note. And there in the ledger, June 18th, 1858. Boy Thomas, age 7. Purchased by Nathaniel Reed of Charleston for $4.75. Exactly 3 days after the photograph's date. Why would they photograph children they were about to sell? Helen wondered aloud. James frowned. Because this wasn't meant for their records, he said. Someone else wanted this preserved. Looking closer, he noticed again how Thomas's small hands were clenched tight while the others hung loose, open compliant. That tiny act of defiance frozen forever. When James later traced Reed's personal notes, the mystery deepened. Unlike most slaveholders, Reed kept meticulous documentation. Boy Thomas, literate contrary to indication, discovered reading in the stables 1 week after purchase, punishment administered, value diminished. Helen's voice trembled. He could read at 7. Someone must have taught him, James murmured. And whoever did risked everything. Further down the page, a final line. July 3rd. Thomas escaped. Bloodhounds dispatched. A child, barely 7, running into the woods of South Carolina with nothing but his mind and his courage. Did he survive? And if he did, who helped him? James leaned back, staring at the image once more. The boy's eyes still met his across more than a century and a half, fearless, unbroken. That night, in the quiet of the archives, James placed the photograph beneath ultraviolet light. And for the first time, faint writing began to appear in the margins, words invisible for generations. What secret had someone hidden there? And why? Along the bottom edge of the photograph, nearly invisible to the naked eye, faint words shimmered under ultraviolet light. Remember them, TWW. James read the letters aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. TWW. Could that be our photographer? The initials sent him searching through 1850s Georgia records of early photographers, and soon one name surfaced from the archives like a ghost: Thomas Woodson. A free black man in Savannah who had dared to establish his own photography studio in an age when freedom itself was fragile. This was incredibly dangerous work, James explained later to the museum's director, Dr. Amelia Phillip. If Woodson was secretly documenting the truth, the real faces and sufferings of slavery, that would explain why these images were never part of official collections. Amelia nodded slowly. They would have been hidden, passed hand to hand through the same networks that carried people to freedom. Further digging confirmed their suspicion. Woodson's name appeared in the journals of Northern abolitionists, one of whom had written photographs from W that will change hearts if we can circulate them safely. Meanwhile, Helen had been tracing the path of young Thomas, the boy from the photograph. According to plantation ledgers, his first escape had failed. He was captured, punished severely, yet curiously never sold. Helen looked puzzled as she read aloud a note from September 1858. Boy Thomas, assigned to kitchen duties under cook Martha. Restricted from field work due to continued flight risk. That's unusual, James murmured. Why keep a child they saw as a problem? The answer arrived in a letter from Nathaniel Reed to a business associate. Martha claims the boy is her grandson and has threatened to poison the household should he be sold. She is the finest cook in Charleston, irreplaceable. I have acquiesced to her demands. For now, James exhaled slowly. He had family protecting him, he said softly. And maybe connections to Woodson, our photographer. The puzzle pieces were beginning to form something larger. A quiet web of defiance, love, and documentation hidden in plain sight. Weeks later, James traveled to Charleston to examine what remained of the old Reed plantation. The main house was gone, but the kitchen still stood, a small brick structure with soot-darkened walls. The site historian guided them through her voice, low in the echoing space. Martha was highly valued, she said. She had unusual leverage for an enslaved woman. In the dusty plantation accounts, her name appeared often Christmas bonus to Martha for exceptional service. Special allowance for fabric governor's dinner. She built goodwill, James noted, but she used it to shield the boy. Near the hearth under a loosened floorboard found during renovations in the 1970s, conservators had once discovered a small bundle. A child's reading primer, its pages covered with careful, uneven letters. A carved wooden figure worn smooth from being held, and a folded scrap of paper, its words, crude but unmistakable. Thomas learning good. Dangerous but proud. James stared at the note in silence. Martha was teaching him to read, he whispered, continuing what someone else had started before he was sold. Helen joined him later that evening over a video call. It makes sense, she said quietly. Martha was sometimes sent to Charleston for events. She would have met people, maybe Woodson himself. I think you're right, James replied. She was positioning Thomas for another escape, and Woodson? He was documenting the truth she was living. The following morning, James found a brittle newspaper clipping from 1861. The headline read, Slave Uprising Concerns as War Approaches. Notable escape of cook and child from Reed Plantation amid chaos. Reward offered. He read it aloud in disbelief. They got away, he whispered. Martha and Thomas. They made it. As the Civil War broke out, their names vanished from Southern records. But James couldn't stop wondering, where had they gone? Did they find safety? Or were they lost again to the silence of history? That search led him north to Philadelphia and to Dr. Vanessa Johnson, a scholar of the Underground Railroad. Charleston, she explained, had one of the most sophisticated urban networks in the South, a spider's web of safe houses and coded routes. For someone like Martha, she said, tracing her finger across an old map escape was dangerous, but not impossible. Then she handed James a collection of letters written by William Still, one of the Underground Railroad's most respected conductors. In one dated December 1861, Still wrote received and her grandson T recently from Charleston. Boy shows remarkable literacy and observation. James's heart pounded. That has to be them. There's more, Vanessa said, eyes shining. Still noted that the boy carried images of importance sewn into his clothing, photographs. James sat back silent. Could those have been Woodson's hidden images, proof of the world they'd escaped, carried against the boy's own heart? The trail carried James northward into the heart of Philadelphia's pre-war black community, a place alive with hope and danger in equal measure. City directories from 1862 listed a Martha employed as a cook in the home of a known abolitionist family. And in a small ledger from a Quaker-run school for formerly enslaved children, another name appeared, Thomas, age 11. Advanced reader. James smiled faintly as he read it aloud. He was receiving an education, he said softly. Martha's courage, it paid off. But what came next would astonish even him. Among the letters of Frederick Douglass, preserved in the Library of Congress, James found one passage that seemed to shimmer with recognition. A remarkable young man lately from bondage carries with him powerful evidence of the conditions in Georgia's plantations. His testimony and photographs have proven most persuasive in our overseas appeals. James looked up at Vanessa, almost afraid to speak. "He was working with them," he whispered. "With Douglas himself." Vanessa nodded. "Those photographs weren't just relics anymore," she said. "They became weapons tools in the global campaign against slavery. As the Civil War deepened, the records showed Thomas, barely a teenager, aiding Union forces. Sometimes as a messenger, sometimes as a guide. His literacy and his intimate knowledge of plantation layouts made him invaluable. He transformed from a victim into an agent of change, James murmured. That spark in his eyes, the defiance we saw in that old photograph, it wasn't a fleeting expression. It was who he was. Together, he and Helen studied the wartime documents. A 1864 report mentioned a youth from Charleston, known as T, serving as a local guide for Union troops in coastal Georgia. The officer's note read, "His intelligence regarding plantation layouts near Savannah greatly aided our advance reducing civilian harm." Helen shook her head in quiet awe. He would have been only 13 or 14. "Children grew up fast in those days," James replied, "especially those who already knew too much." Meanwhile, Martha's path surfaced again, this time in records from a contraband camp under Union control. She was listed as Martha Formerly of Charleston. Head cook. Feeds both soldiers and refugees. Skills exceed most. She survived, Helen whispered. And she kept caring for others even in exile. When the war ended and Reconstruction began, Thomas returned to the classroom. An 1866 entry from a Freedmen's Bureau school listed him as 15 advanced placement assists in teaching younger students. His instructor had written in the margin shows exceptional aptitude for science and writing. And then came a discovery that changed everything. In a small daguerreotype dated 1867, a young black man stood tall beside a gleaming camera, his expression calm, steady, familiar. On the back in careful script were the words, "Studio Apprentice Thomas, with gratitude T. Woodson." James stared at it for a long time before speaking. "It's him. The connection is confirmed." Thomas Woodson took him as an apprentice. From Woodson's own diary, a fragile journal preserved among the papers of early black photographers, James read a final, almost tender entry. Young T shows remarkable eye for composition. His vision for truth comes from bitter experience, yet he captures beauty and dignity in every frame. Helen's voice trembled when she spoke. He went from being the subject of a photograph that dehumanized him to becoming the man behind the lens, restoring humanity to others. That's extraordinary. James nodded. A full circle, he murmured. But the story doesn't end there. Because after 1870, the trail began to fade. Business directories mentioned a T. Walker photographer first in Philadelphia, then later in Boston. Walker, Helen asked. "That's not his surname. Many freed people chose new names," James explained. Walker was common, it meant freedom, mobility. The ability to move forward. In Boston's archives, they found advertisements for Walker's authentic portraits. Each promised true dignity in every image. And indeed, the surviving photographs were unlike anything else from that era. Black families, seated proudly in their best attire, not as curiosities or anthropological subjects as white photographers so often portrayed them, but as individuals, as people. His approach was revolutionary, James told the museum board later. While others reduced his community to types and categories, Thomas captured the full complexity of their lives. Financial records suggested the studio had struggled, at first relying on a small but loyal clientele. Boston's black elite and progressive white patrons who understood the quiet power of what he was doing. But by 1880, the listings stopped. Walker's authentic portraits vanished from the directories without explanation. James sat back in his chair, the silence of the archive settling around him like dust. What had become of Thomas, the boy with the defiant eyes who had survived slavery, war, and exile, only to disappear again, this time into history itself? The mystery deepened when Helen uncovered an old newspaper announcement from Chicago. New studio opening. T. Walker, photographer of Boston, brings his celebrated approach to Chicago's growing community. The Chicago City Directories confirmed it. Thomas had relocated, opening a larger studio that specialized in family portraits and documentary images of modern black life. Through the 1880s, his business flourished, a rare and remarkable success for a black entrepreneur of that era. A feature in a local paper described him as Mr. Walker, though quiet about his early life, speaks passionately about photography's power to reveal truth and create understanding. His photographs of working-class families appeared in national publications, and as James later noted, he wasn't just taking pictures, he was bearing witness. Thomas had evolved from apprentice to innovator, crafting a visual language that stood against the cruel caricatures of the age. His lens revealed not despair but dignity. Black lives as they truly were, proud, complex, and deeply human. In post-Reconstruction America, that was nothing short of revolutionary. But in the archives of the Chicago Historical Society, James stumbled upon devastating news. Thomas's studio had been destroyed in a suspicious fire in 1891. Fire marshal investigating blaze at Negro photographer's studio, the newspaper reported. Owner T. Walker claims arson following publication of controversial images. Entire collection lost. What were those controversial images? James whispered, the question aloud, feeling the chill of history tighten around him. The answer came from an unexpected source, the personal papers of Ida B. Wells, the fearless journalist who had documented lynchings across America. Wells had once commissioned Thomas to photograph a lynching site just a day after a killing. His photographs exposed what officials tried to hide, that the victim had been tortured before death. In her own notes, Wells wrote, his technical skill captured details the authorities tried to erase. Within days of the image's limited circulation, Walker's studio burned. As James traced the aftermath, a grim pattern emerged. Thomas had been systematically documenting racial violence and inequality, building a visual archive that contradicted the polished lies of public record. Insurance documents revealed the scale of the loss. 23 albums of documentary photographs, over 100 glass plate negatives of historical significance, the inventory read. All destroyed. Police reports added something darker. Thomas himself had been beaten by unknown assailants, warned to stop making trouble with that camera. They tried to silence him, James said quietly. But did they? The answer came from a letter Thomas had written after recovering from his injuries. They may have destroyed my studio and my negatives, but not my resolve. I have secured new equipment and will continue my work more carefully. Some images survived, the ones I kept closest. Even after all he had endured, Thomas's defiance remained unbroken. The same fierce spirit James had seen in the eyes of that 7-year-old boy in the plantation photograph. After the fire, Thomas vanished from public record. For years, there was no trace until James found a deed to a small farm outside Chicago, purchased in 1892 under the name Thomas W. Freeman. Another name change Helen murmured. Freeman. A statement in itself. Local records described a quiet farmer with an unusual hobby taking pictures. He married a school teacher named Ruth, and together they raised 2 children. The final breakthrough came decades later when James located Thomas's granddaughter Elizabeth Carter, now in her 80s, living in Illinois. Grandpa Thomas didn't talk much about his early life, she said softly. But he never stopped taking photographs. Our cellar was his dark room. She led James up to her attic, where a withered trunk waited beneath a layer of dust. Inside were the remnants of her grandfather's life's work and, astonishingly, the original plantation photograph that had started James's entire investigation. He kept this all his life, James whispered. Elizabeth nodded, her eyes distant. He said it reminded him of where he came from and why his work mattered. Inside the weathered trunk lay hundreds of photographs, a lifetime of moments spanning decades. Images of Black Americans in their everyday lives, at work, at church, in celebration, in mourning. Together, they formed a complete visual narrative, a quiet, enduring challenge to the distorted depictions that had dominated the nation's memory. But among the stacks of photographs, one discovery left James breathless. It was a small handwritten manuscript. On its cover in faded ink, the title read, "From Property to Photographer." The first line began, "I was 7 years old when a man named Woodson risked his life to show the world what slavery truly meant. His courage taught me that a camera could be more powerful than a rifle." Within those fragile pages, Thomas had recorded everything his first lessons in reading and writing taught in secret by Martha. His escape from the plantation, the chaos of war, and finally his devotion to using photography not as art alone, but as truth. He wrote this for the future, Elizabeth explained softly. He always said, someday, America would be ready to see itself clearly. James realized then that he hadn't just solved the mystery of the plantation photograph. He had uncovered something far greater, a first-hand account that stretched from the age of slavery through Reconstruction and beyond. The life story of a man who had transformed himself from a possession into a witness. 6 months later, James stood in the hushed center of the National Museum of African American History's newest exhibition, From Property to Photographer, The Extraordinary Journey of Thomas Walker Freeman. At the heart of the gallery hung the original plantation photograph, the same one that had begun it all, now finally given the context it deserved. Around it, Thomas's portraits traced the arc of his life and work, showing his evolution from subject to storyteller, from survivor to artist. The exhibition drew visitors from across the world. People moved slowly beneath the dim lights, stopping before each image as though in conversation with the past. Some wept, others simply stood in silence. What strikes me most, James told a small group of students, is how Thomas reclaimed photography itself. The same medium that once documented him as property became his weapon of truth, his way of asserting humanity. Thomas's memoir had been carefully preserved, digitized and published to critical acclaim. His photographs, hidden for decades, now fill textbooks, galleries, and classrooms. In the final room, a large screen displayed his images alongside the works of modern photographers who carried his vision forward, each frame echoing the same defiant tenderness, the same unflinching honesty. Elizabeth Carter attended the opening with her children and grandchildren. Standing before the plantation photograph, she whispered, "He would be amazed to see this. Not just his work being honored, but how the conversation about our history has changed." James nodded quietly. The objects on the ground in that first photograph, the shackles, the whip, they were meant to hide in plain sight, he said. But Thomas spent his life bringing hidden truths into focus. As visitors continued to stream into the exhibition, James watched their faces. The recognition, the reflection, the quiet ache of understanding. What had begun with a single faded photograph had unfolded into something far larger, the rediscovery of a man's journey, and through it, a clearer lens on America's own. Through Thomas's eyes and his camera, the story became unmistakable. A path from enslavement to selfhood, from silence to expression. A testament to resistance, to resilience, and to the power of remembering what others tried to erase.